So what Jesus is offering us, all of us.
By the time I was born, my parents had already been rolling with the church for about
Mm-hmm.
5 years. They started a Bible college and a Christian school, kindergarten through 12th grade. The same year they started the church. And then, yeah, by the time I was born, it was massive. It was growing fast and thousands of people every Sunday coming. And
Mm-hmm.
the school was growing fast, the college, there was a missionary training center. And then later on, growing up, I was the youngest of four kids, but my dad and mom, they used to take all of us out to low income apartment housing on Friday nights, Saturday nights, and they would do like these pop up tent crusades. He would preach, my mom would sing, me and my brother and sisters, we would do like children's church services. And later on, that became, we started a place called the Tulsa Dream Center,
Yeah.
inspired by Tommy Barnett,
Yeah.
Matthew Barnett, those guys, Luke Barnett. But my dad was always a visionary. He was always starting something new. He started a camp when I was like 8 years old. We got 120 acres out in like the wilderness area of Oklahoma, about an hour from our church. And so there was the camp, there was the school, there was the college, there was the dream center, there was the church. And then in 2009, he got sick with cancer and he passed away suddenly. And I write about in my book, Mind Games, I write about just the spiral of depression, discouragement, anxiety, fear, panic, worry, everything, every mind game that you can imagine that I walked through. And I think a lot of other people walked through in our church when it came to a crisis of faith.
Mm.
And where do you stand when the person that you thought for sure was going to see a miracle because he was the guy that prayed for other people who had miracles, it doesn't happen. And so the disappointment and then the loss, not just the loss of him, but the loss of what it was like when he was around. You know, our finances started going down. Our attendance started bleeding fast. Thousands of people left the church. And so I share in my book, in Mind Games, I talk about really what I was up against before I stepped in as pastor. There was a period of about 4.5 years where my mom stepped in as an interim pastor, and she's my hero. I love my mom. Still alive, still helps in the church, runs
Good.
our prayer ministry.
Good.
And she was mourning the loss of her husband as a widow. And then she was trying to lead our church through a very bleeding, difficult season. And at that same time, I was the college pastor. I was in charge of a lot of different areas. I was the associate pastor. And then my dad, before he died, had told our board, hey, Paul, my youngest son, is going to be the next pastor of Victory, but he's not ready yet. So don't tell him I said this until it's time. So, you know, a year after he's passed away, the board comes to me and they're like, hey, in a couple of years, you're going to step in as pastor. My mom says it. And there was just a whole lot that I share in my book. My book it's long, it's 240 pages, but I detail some pretty important stories that I think would relate to anyone out there who's ever walked through loss, failure, disappointment, anger at God, anger at the church. And then what do you do with all of this? What do you do with all the mind games of what the enemy wants to do? The enemy wants to steal, kill, and destroy our faith, our connection with God, with the church, with our family. And so I talk about, you know, how I got my mind back, how I got my heart beating again. And it wasn't me, obviously, it was the Holy Spirit, God. But I talk about some practical tools that I personally applied and some pretty funny stories that I go into about when you're a pastor's kid, like, you know, this, growing up with a father who was in the spotlight, there's a lot of pressure to be perfect. There's a lot of pressure I grew up in the same school that my dad was the pastor over. He was the president of the school and the college. And so then I go to ORU right across the street from our church, and he ends up becoming the interim president for a season while I was at ORU right before he passed away. But I'll tell you this, one thing that kind of starts off the book is that right before he passed, I remember getting a phone call from my mom. She's like, hey, come up to the hospital. Your dad's up here. And I was like, who's he praying for? And she was like, no, he's not praying for anyone. He's here. And I was like, what do you mean he's there? He's never at the hospital for himself. He's always there to pray for church members or staff members, whatever. And she was like, no, Paul, just get up here. So I rushed up there September of 2009. And when I walked in, the doctor immediately just says the words in front of my whole family. He's like, your dad has lymphoma cancer. And we're not sure how long he's going to make it.
Mm.
And then he looks at us and he's like, he's been battling this for a year and 2 months.
Oh.
And I go, what? And I lost it. I started bawling. I was like, why didn't you tell us? He was secretly battling cancer for a year and preached every Sunday, never told the family, never told the church, and was making private visits to the cancer treatment center. And he told us he was sorry that he didn't say anything. He just didn't want us worried. He didn't want our fear adding to his anxiety. So he was trying to privately beat the battle. And so I talk about it in the book, just the paranoia of like, oh my gosh, what in the world? And then 7 weeks later, the last public thing he does is my wedding, and then he passes away. Man. And right before he passed, he gave me this key. I had just finally gotten hired on at the church. I had graduated from college, and when you're a pastor's kid, you're free labor. So you just work for free. But by the time I was 22, I finally got a job offer at the church, and I was graduated. And I started working in our college ministry, our worship ministry. And he gives me this key. He's like, hey, here's a key to your office. And I was like, Dad, I was a janitor at Oral Roberts University, and I had 30 keys. And I was like, I'm your own flesh and blood, and you're only giving me one key. And he was like, Paul, what's your problem? And I was like, Dad, I'm just saying, like, I just want access. I want trust. I want people to know my dad trusts me. And he's like, no, you just need one key, son. And so when he passed away, I was locked out all the time. I was locked out of our main campus. I was locked out of the Dream Center. I was locked out of the college, the camp. And I would always call a security guard, a janitor. I was like, hey, can you unlock the doors? And they were like, why didn't your dad give you a key? And I was like, I don't know. And I would look up at heaven, because I honestly still to this day feel like sometimes I can talk to him up there. Like he's looking down from a window. Hebrews 12 says there's a great cloud of witnesses. And I just believe that maybe those witnesses sometimes can hear, And so I just was like, Dad, many nights I would go up to the church to just pray and talk to God. And then honestly, I probably looked like a lunatic, but I was also kind of like venting my anger at my dad. And I was like, I wish you were still here. Why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have helped you, battle cancer and come out on top of it. And so I would have these conversations, but janitors, security guards had to unlock the doors to let me in. So long story short, a couple of years had passed since he had passed away. One night I was trying to get into the church. No one was there. It was Thursday night. And he built this 5,000 seat auditorium right before he passed away, which at the time when he built it, when he was alive, I think it was going to be good. But once he passed, it was very sad. And so I felt intimidated by the whole building, 400,000 square feet, just so much space, the school, the college, the camp, the Dream Center, the church, this big auditorium, and then me with one key. And I just felt unqualified. I felt like I didn't have the keys to do what my dad did. I couldn't cast vision like he casted vision. I couldn't raise money like he raised money. I couldn't preach like he preached. I couldn't connect with donors like he connected. I couldn't meet with presidents. Like I just didn't have what he had. And one night I was trying to get in the church and no janitor was there. They were like, hey, we're locking up doors on the other side of town at the Dream Center. It's going to be an hour before we can get back to South Tulsa. You'll just have to wait. So I start trying to break into our church, and I'm like pounding the glass door, hurting my hand. And I was like, once again, I'm weak. I'm unqualified. I'm the youngest. I'm the worst person to be picked for this. And then I started to shimmy my credit card between the cracks of the doors. I was like, okay, I'm going to pick the lock, and I break my credit card. Finally, I pull out my keys, and I was like, okay, I'm going to try my car key, my house key. None of those keys are working. And I was like, okay, this little office key my dad gave me, I'm going to shove it in this outside door of our main out of building. And then I'm going to wiggle it around and yank the door. Well, when I shoved it in, it fit perfectly. And I was like, what? And then I turned it and it unlocked the door. And I stepped back and I had goosebumps. I was like, what in the world? Did God just morph my key? And then I thought, well, maybe this key works on other doors. So I run across the hallway and I stick it in there, unlocks that door, unlocks this door, unlocks the choir room, unlocks the drum closet. Nobody has keys to the drum closet. Unlocks the gymnasium. And then I think to myself, this whole time, I've had the master key to victory. and I didn't even know it. And so then I went to that main auditorium door that intimidated me and scared me, and the room that I honestly didn't really like going into because it was sad. And I said, God, if this key works on this door, everything's going to change. And it did. It unlocked the door. And I sat on the stage and I looked at this empty room of thousands of seats. And I just cried. And then I looked up at heaven and I was like, Dad, this whole time I've had the master key. And I could just see him laughing up in heaven, like, duh, you've had it the whole time, son. And I think maybe he wanted me to figure it out, to discover what it could do without him telling me. And that I had to go through some depressing moments. I mean, there was a moment in that same season where I stood on a bridge and I was looking at semi trucks and cars driving underneath this highway overpass. And I was contemplating if life was worth living because it was so painful. You know, I had to lay off 120 employees in a matter of a year, people that raised me. And I remember just feeling so angry and unworthy and unqualified and just like a failure, like I'm going to lose this legacy and all this stuff. And that night when I sat on that stage, I just held that master key to victory and I stuck it in my Bible and I said, okay, God, I have the master key to victory, not just physically, but I have the master key to victory spiritually. I have the master key to victory mentally and emotionally. And I turned to Colossians 1:27 and it says, Christ in me. And I just stopped right there. I said, Christ in me is the master key. Christ in me is the master key to victory. Christ in me is the master key to a sound mind. Christ in me is the master key to vision. Christ in me is the master key to victory over all of these financial struggles that we're walking through. And then I started preaching. I preached a whole sermon to an empty room. And I just held out the Bible and I put the master key in the middle. And I said, I'm not the only one with the master key. You have the master key and you have the master key. And if you have Jesus, you have the master key. And I just started crying. And that from that night in 2012, I started writing this thought that, you know, if we have Jesus, we can make it through anything, but we can also unlock doors. And I started looking in my Bible for all the scriptures about keys and about doors. And I started realizing there's a lot about that. I mean, even when you get to the book of Revelation, Jesus, he says, I hold the keys. And so I started writing this thought about winning the mind games, winning the battle in our mind by knowing we have the key to victory. And so I tell, like, once I stepped in as pastor in 2014, by the goodness of God, the bleeding stopped, our attendance started increasing, our finances got better. We were able to rehire people we had let go. We were able to hire more people. We were able to expand our school, our dream center, our college, our camp. And when COVID hit, I thought that was going to end us. And I write a whole couple of chapters on trauma and anxiety and panic because our whole world went through a season of just honestly shock, fear, anger at the government, the control, the shutdown, the COVID, the virus, all of it. Yeah. So I talk about just what we did, what I did walking through that. I'm a dad of 5 kids. I have a 10-year-old, 8-year-old, 5-year-old, 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And so, yeah, I was spiraling into, once again, that same fear of like, oh, are we going to make it? But the book is all about winning in the mind.
If you have a 2-year-old, you have a COVID baby.
Yeah, she was born in 21. We got pregnant in COVID, literally like June. And I fell on the floor. I collapsed because we had 4 babies and we were barely making it with 4 babies. And we were finally on our last one to change diapers. And Ashley comes to me during the middle of COVID, like the fall of COVID year. And she's like, hey, we're pregnant with number 5. And I was like, what? But we got through it. And now she's like the most beautiful gift of God's grace to us.
Yeah. Okay. I got several questions. What a great story. Because it illustrates a lot. It says a lot. So I got several questions for you. First one is a tough one because I know that I know the charismatic line on health and healing, and I have to ask you, and I don't mean to step on toes, but I just know too many people have gone through this. Was the health equated? Was your dad's physical health equated to his spiritual faith in the culture you were in at the time?
I think that honestly, I'll say this. When he was in the hospital, he was laying there and he was praying for a miracle. And I'd never heard him say this before because he was always the guy that was quoting, like, by his stripes I am healed. I'm the
Sure.
healed of the Lord. I
Sure.
will live and not die, declare the works of the Lord, all the scriptures. But in the hospital, he said, I'm open to whatever God has for me.
Mm.
And I looked at him and was like, what? He's like, whatever God has for me. And he said, I'm thankful for what God has given me.
Mm.
And it was very different, different from who he once was. Something changed in that hospital room. I don't think he lost faith.
No.
I think he came to grips with a more deeper faith. And
Yes.
our family did. I mean, I went through a whole, in my book, I talk about how I stopped praying for miracles. I stopped praying for healing for a season. I didn't want to go to the hospital. People would ask me to pray for their family member with cancer. And I was like, don't ask me, you know?
Yeah.
But then I came full circle, and I now fully will pray for anyone who
Good.
needs healing. I'll pray for anyone with cancer. But I had to walk through a season of trying to figure out why God didn't do it, and come to the conclusion of what was wrong. You know, because when you're in the Word of Faith circle and the healing, like growing up with Oral Roberts as my dad's mentor, it's just, there's so much faith talk.
Yeah.
And so I got to the point where it was like I went to the other side, the other extreme of like non-faith talk. And then I had to come back to the middle and go, okay, there is a really good side of this, but there's also a really unhealthy, toxic side of this. And then if I swing to the other side of the pendulum, it can also become toxic and negative and pessimistic, and God's not even on the throne. And, you know, it's like all these. So it's like coming back to the middle of like, God can, and maybe God will. But even if he doesn't, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego,
Yeah.
like even if he doesn't deliver us from the fire, we still won't bow down to your false gods, Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what I came to, is that, hey, God could have healed my dad, but he didn't. And that's okay. Like, we don't have to figure that out. And if I spend my whole life trying to figure that out, I'll be angry, bitter, and never happy with my life. I had to let that go.
Here's what I would say. I would say he did, and not in the way that we think, because we look at healing as a physical thing, and certainly it can be. And anytime I'm sick, I ask God to heal me, and I go to the doctor. You know, so
Yes.
I do it all. Do it all. I mean, you know, Oral
Both.
Roberts right there, the City of Faith. He put medicine and prayer together, right? And I fully agree with that. So I am never not going to ask God to heal me. But that's where my faith begins. It's not where it ends, right?
Yes.
Maybe you've noticed this. You know, we know the story about the guy that was low. You heard this growing up at Christian school. I mean, you probably had you're too young to have the felt things, but you know, the illustrations, the kid story.
I remember the felt boards.
You remember the felt boards. Okay. So you know the guy that they opened the roof and they lowered him to get him to Jesus because they wanted him to be physically healed. He couldn't walk. Okay. I would ask the same thing. What did Jesus do? I mean, we know he healed him, but that's not what he did first. Do you know what he did first?
He said, son, your sins are forgiven.
Yes. 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 And then the Pharisees were like, who is this man to forgive sins? And he's like, what, do you want me to heal his body? Okay, get up and walk. Like, no big deal. Almost nonchalantly, right? Because he knew the greater miracle was the healing of the soul. Don't fear that which can kill the body, he said. Fear that can kill the soul. He healed that man's soul by forgiving his sins. The man would live for eternity.
Yeah.
And then he said, okay, fine, get up and walk. I mean, he brought Lazarus back from the grave, but Lazarus died again, right? The healing we ask for in the physical sense is temporary, always. The true healing is eternal, and that's the forgiveness of sins. And that's why your dad is still alive today. More alive than us, I would argue.
Yeah. Yes. And I agree with you on all that.
Yeah.
100%.
And so I have other friends that have been through similar situations where they've lost a loved one who was a person of great faith, but they equated their faith to their physical healing, and it stumped them. And I think that we we have to be in the center where you're at, that realizes that the true healing is the eternal healing, the forgiveness of sins. That's eternal life. This all, whether you live, I lost my younger sister at 40 to cancer. She's buried up there in Tulsa, and left 3 young children at the time. It sucks, man. It's painful. It's hard. I would never deny that. But I know her sins were forgiven in Christ. She is alive forever.
Yeah.
When that's our faith is not in our faith. Our faith is in a person who is alive, and that's Christ. And that's I love that you you understand that. We have to be there, because I've seen some people really be hurt and disillusioned when someone who was a person of strong faith died unexpectedly, too soon, whatever. And so I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I love what God showed you through that. Okay, my next question, what was it? I got sidetracked on that one. Okay, here's my next question. And you know this. This is true for everybody, though. But when you're following a successful father, and I see this in secular business too, and you have to find your own calling. You have to find who God says you are, even when you're following in the footsteps of someone else, because you're not your dad. Right?
Yeah.
We honor our fathers. We honor the work that they have done, the things that they have started, but we are not them. Where did you find Paul?
I found myself, it kind of right when he passed, I was preaching to our college students, and our college service was growing rapidly. And so I knew, like, okay, either we're doing something right here, or we're doing something wrong and God's just blessing it anyways. But I had this feeling like, okay, I think God has given me a unique voice to reach my generation.
Yes.
And I didn't sound like my dad. My dad, he would be the one that would share maybe one personal story every 6 weeks. And every sermon he would share, 25 scriptures and several thoughts around those scriptures, but no personal transparency. And if you got a story from my dad, it was never going to be a story that was vulnerable. It was always a story from 30 years ago. You know what I'm saying? So my stories were a lot more personal, more frequent on a weekly basis. I was more candid and vulnerable, and kind of just like, hey, this is who I am. If you don't like me, I totally get it. I'm not my dad. And that's why I struggled whenever I didn't realize I had the master key. I had to come to that conclusion that the master key is not sounding like Billy Joe Daugherty. It's not preaching like him, leading like him, doing what he did. It's discovering the unique Christ in me.
Yes.
That Christ wants to manifest through my unique personality, through my gifts. I'm a singer. I'm a musician. I play piano and guitar. My dad didn't really play music, and he didn't really sing a lot. But my mom does. So I have a lot of my mom's side of the musical, songwriting, singing. And then I have some of my dad in me from like his style of maybe leading that naturally comes to me that I didn't know was there until I had to step in. But yeah, I think it was maneuvering through that. My first year as pastor, I tried to sound like my dad. I tried to wear a suit. I tried to wear a tie. I tried to comb my hair like his, and people would laugh. They liked it. People were coming. And then after about a year and a half of that, there was this guy who was a friend of mine. And he was like, hey, Paul, you've been trying to wear your dad's shoes long enough. Because my mom gave me 2 pairs of my dad's shoes after he died. And so I literally was wearing his black, nice dress shoes. And my friend comes and gives me a pair of nice Chelsea brown boots that are more young. They would fit a guy who's like 25, 26, which was my age when I first started, or 29 is when I started. So he hands me a pair of boots and he's like, these fit you well. And he's like, it's time to wear your own shoes. And I knew what he meant, not just wear my own physical shoes, but wear my own shoes. So probably after that first year of being the pastor, when I turned 30, I stepped into a greater level of confidence, and I stopped trying to be like my dad. I stopped trying to convince people that, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But I wanted people to know I still carry the same belief system. I didn't want them thinking like Paul's going to take this church down some crazy, just different type of theology. I was like, hold on, I still believe in the same Jesus, same God, same Bible,
Sure.
but I'm going to communicate it differently,
So would you say that you are beyond the point of feeling like you need to prove yourself and you're comfortable with God's calling on your life?
Yes, 100%. And I don't say that from a prideful place, but I just know what it was like for me before I crossed that. I think COVID also really helped like solidify it. In 2020, I called a couple of pastors like, hey, what are you going to do? The first week of the shutdowns, this was March 17th, March 15th. And every pastor was like, oh, I'm closing down, shutting down. And I just was not feeling that in my heart. I was like, I don't want to bash anybody. Everybody has to do what they feel called to do.
Sure.
But I prayed, I cried, I sat with my wife, and I was like, I really feel like we're supposed to stay open, but maybe we do it different. Maybe we do rooftop services. And so that next week, I announced on social media, I said, hey, I'm going to get up on top of the roof. I'm going to preach with an FM transmitter. We're going to put speakers around the parking lot. You can also turn your radio in your car to 97.6, and you're going to hear my voice. Our band is going to play with me up on the roof, and we're going to do church for the next 12 weeks or however long this thing lasts. And it blew up. People were watching from all over the world. We started averaging 60,000 plus people live watching online. And then CNN, Fox News, MSNBC picked it up. So it kind of went international. But in that moment, I didn't look back. I just said, you know what? I know I'm already getting arrows thrown at my back by people in the church, evangelical people who were saying he's reckless. He doesn't care about people. And I was like, hold on. We're all still social distancing. We're just meeting for church, and we're still having online church because people were like, just stay online, stay home. And I was like, I hear you, but this is what I feel called to do in this moment. And I think we have to give room for people to express whatever they feel is the right thing to do for their community and not shoot arrows at each other. It doesn't help the kingdom at all.
Yeah. No. And now we know Dr. Fauci has admitted that the 6-foot social distancing thing was random. So, I mean, you look back on it and you go,
so much of it was just craziness.
It was just craziness, which really to me drives home this whole issue of you got to learn to hear the voice of God for yourself. He's not going to say the same thing to everybody in specifics. His character is going to stay the same. His truth is going to stay the same, but the expression of it's going to be very individualistic. And then you obey, right? So here's, and I'll kind of try to wind it down with this. I could keep going. It was a fabulous conversation, very helpful. But in the anxiety, the stress, the doubt, all these things that contribute to an unhealthy mental and emotional state, a lot of stuff you walk through. In finding a deeper faith, in finding your own faith and identity, what did that do for your emotional and mental health? Because I think this is key.
Yeah. Well, one, it helps me to calm down. I think people who are mentally unwell, they are or emotionally unwell, they are wound up, they are unhappy, they are constant racing thoughts. They can't turn their thoughts off. I found a lot of people who are mentally unwell have insomnia. They can't sleep good at night. And by the way, I don't think that makes us a sinner. I don't think that makes us bad. I don't think that makes us messed up. I think that just makes us a candidate for God's grace and God's healing work to work in our minds. You look at Elijah. Elijah was mentally and emotionally unstable. After some of his greatest miracles, he runs into the wilderness. He's depressed. He's suicidal, racing thoughts. He's got he's got God in his heart, but he's got Jezebel on his mind, you know? And it's like, you can love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, but still be mentally and emotionally unhealthy. And that's like, even growing up with a dad who was a pastor and a mighty man of God, I know there were times he struggled, you know, in his mind, in his heart, in his emotions. I know there were times Oral Roberts did, Billy Graham did, Mother Teresa, James Robinson, the list goes on, you know. None of us are exempt from thoughts and feelings that are painful, that can lead us into places of loneliness, sadness, depression, deep feelings of anxiety. And so for me, I think this is a battle we're going to face the rest of our lives. You know, I don't think it's something we graduate from, but I do think that we can get out of the rut of stuck in a season of depression or a season of deep anxiety. And for me, yeah, it definitely shifted. It shifted me into a place of more of peace, more sound mind, more joy, and more freedom, like less worry about, you know, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? What if my kids get sick? What if we don't make it? You know, what if? And I stopped thinking about all the what if negatives, and I just started focusing on, okay, God, you love me. You're for me. You're with me. We're going to get through it. And so it gave me more strength to finish a day and go to sleep and wake up the next day and start the battle again. And I think, you know, we're going to be in our mind game battles the rest of our lives. I don't think we ever graduate that, but I do think we can get better at winning those games. So
it's interesting because you know, the past is a place that caused a lot of pain, and just dealing with it, right? Things that happened in the past, and that kind of spills over into anxiety about the future.
Yeah.
Are you learning? Because we do this. This is an ongoing thing. Are you learning to live in the present?
Yes. Yes. And I think that was a big win, was just because even during COVID, I was like, every day, you know, you never know what's going to happen. So you just have to live in that day, and you can't worry about tomorrow. And so, and then
I know a guy who said that. There's a guy who said that one time, a long time ago. Don't worry about tomorrow. Right?
Come on. But I think that once we start winning those mind games, we can start enjoying the present. I can look at my 2-year-old girl and really look her in the blue eyes that she has, and hold my little brown-eyed boy, and look at all 5 kids. And we have dinner. We have candlelight dinner at least once a week, where we'll just light the candles and we say, Christ is light. My wife will cook a really good meal. And it's just, I mean, this past year, we were both just crying, laughing, my wife and I, because we were like, this was the best year for our family. We made the best memories together, just fully present, fully enjoying each other.
Love it. And that's so key. That is a big key to mental health right there, man. Okay. If you're watching and you want to know more, you're just going to have to pick up the book. It's available wherever you get books. It's called Mind Games by Paul Daugherty. And I want also to let people know about the Paulcast, the podcast called the Paulcast. Great name, by the way. Just tell people about it, because if somebody's watching and they're like, man, I want to hear more from this guy, you can go to victory.com. You can go to pauldaugherty.org, and it's D-A-U, for those of you listening, Paul, P-A-U-L, P-A-U-L, got that, D-A-U-G-H-E-R-T-Y. It's not Daugherty, it's Daugherty. So, .org, by the way. So, but victory.com, easier to get to. But what do you have? I'm guessing you got the Sunday sermons, and tell us a little bit about the Paulcast.
Yes. Yeah. So it's Sunday messages. The Paulcast is totally different. No sermons, just conversations. So kind of like you and me right now. This would be on the Paulcast. I would be sitting talking with a pastor or a leader. Sometimes I sit with a guy on our staff, and we just talk about parenthood. We talk about dad life, talk about marriage, ministry, and then we talk about behind the scenes of, you know, things that are happening in my world that would be maybe interesting. So,
all right, good resources for you. Appreciate you. It's encouraging to hear the transparency, but also to hear the journey that God's brought you on and continues to walk with you on. And I wish nothing but the best for Victory Christian Center, the school, all the stuff that you got going on. And just great to hear from you. Thank you, man.
Thank you, Randy. It means a lot. Appreciate you.
Appreciate all you guys out there watching too.